She fed the Apache warrior's baby and became the mother he needed, heart-touching Western love. Cassidy had always loved the open sky. As a medic from the distant space colony of Nova Terra, she was used to the quiet hum of advanced technology, the sterile cleanliness of her medical equipment, and the polished halls of starships. But here, on this raw, wild planet, everything was different. The landscape stretched out before her like an endless canvas, desolate, harsh, and unforgiving. The wind howled across the dusty plains, stirring up clouds of sand that whipped against her skin. Her crew was silent as they navigated their transport vehicle across the arid terrain. Cassidy's eyes were fixed on the horizon, the deep orange sun sinking lower, casting long shadows across the dunes. The mission was simple: map the area, survey the wildlife, and report back to their colony. But, so far, it hadn't gone as planned. A sudden sandstorm had blown in, forcing them to seek shelter. "We'll have to wait it out," Cassidy said, glancing at her captain, a gruff man named Jax. He nodded, guiding the vehicle toward a narrow canyon in the distance. It was their best option for shelter, and Cassidy didn't argue. As the storm intensified, they pulled into the canyon, hoping the rocky walls would protect them from the worst of it. The team disembarked, and the crew quickly set up camp. Cassidy moved about efficiently, checking on their supplies and ensuring the vehicle's systems were secure. The storm raged outside, but in the canyon there was a strange sense of calm. Cassidy stood at the edge, watching the swirling dust, when something caught her eye. A figure, barely visible in the sandstorm, staggered toward the canyon entrance. Her heart skipped a beat. It was a man, an Apache warrior, dressed in tattered clothing and blood-stained rags. He was walking slowly, dragging his feet as if every step was a struggle. Cassidy's first instinct was to call out to him, but she hesitated. The storm made everything feel distant, almost unreal. But the man was real. She could see his sharp features, his face smeared with dirt and blood, and the way his body swayed with exhaustion. Without thinking, Cassidy rushed toward him, her boots crunching in the sand. She called out to him, but the man didn't respond. She reached him just as he collapsed, his body crumpling into the sand. Cassidy knelt beside him, checking his pulse. It was faint but steady. His wounds were bad. His chest had a deep gash, and his arms were covered in cuts and bruises. He was still alive, but barely. "Help! I need help!" Cassidy shouted, her voice rising over the storm. Within moments, Jax and the rest of the crew arrived, but Cassidy waved them off. "Get the medical kit," she ordered. She gently turned the warrior over, feeling his chest rise and fall with each shallow breath. Jax was quick to respond, bringing the kit and setting it down beside her. Cassidy worked quickly, cleaning the man's wounds with antiseptic, carefully stitching the deep cuts on his arm and chest. His breathing grew more stable as she worked, but he remained unconscious, his face pale beneath the dirt. "Who is he?" Jax asked, his voice low, but Cassidy didn't answer. She didn't need to. There was something in the way the warrior held himself, even in unconsciousness. He was strong, a survivor. She could feel it. Cassidy's attention shifted to the warrior's arms. Wrapped in a piece of cloth, she saw something that made her pause, a small bundle of life. Her heart skipped again as she gently unwrapped the cloth, revealing a tiny infant wrapped tightly in the fabric. The baby was barely breathing, its small face pale and fragile. Without hesitation, Cassidy scooped the baby into her arms, cradling it gently. The infant's eyes were shut, and its tiny chest rose and fell with the effort of breathing. She placed her fingers on its little chest, checking for a pulse, and sighed with relief when she felt the steady rhythm. The baby was alive, but barely. "Jax, he has a baby," Cassidy said softly, her voice trembling with the realization of what she was holding. "We need to get them both back to the camp. Now." Jax nodded, his face grim. "We'll move him carefully," he said, helping Cassidy lift the warrior's limp body. They carried him back to camp, where they set him up in a makeshift shelter. Cassidy worked quickly, using her medical expertise to stabilize him, but her attention kept returning to the baby. She couldn't help but stare at the tiny, fragile life in her arms. The storm continued to rage outside, but in the shelter of the canyon, the camp was quiet. Cassidy sat beside the warrior, the baby in her arms, her thoughts swirling. Who was this man? Where had he come from? And how had he ended up here, so far from any known settlement? Hours passed, and the storm finally began to subside. The warrior's condition improved slightly, but he remained unconscious. Cassidy sat by his side, watching over him and the baby. Her crew members were busy with their own tasks, but Cassidy couldn't shake the feeling that she was meant to be here, at this moment, with these two people. As night fell, the warrior began to stir. His eyelids fluttered, and his breath became more even. Cassidy watched him closely, her fingers still resting on the baby's tiny hand. He groaned softly, his eyes opening just enough to see her. There was a brief moment of confusion in his gaze before his eyes settled on the infant in her arms. "Babe," he whispered, his voice rough and strained. "She's okay?" Cassidy nodded, her voice gentle. "She's okay. You're both safe for now." The warrior's eyes fluttered shut again, and he sank back into unconsciousness. Cassie let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She knew he needed more care, but for now, they were safe. For now, they had time. Cassidy looked down at the baby in her arms and then back at the man. She didn't know how or why they had ended up here, but she knew one thing. She couldn't leave them. This was her chance to help, and somehow she would. The days passed slowly, the world outside the canyon still barren and empty, the storm long gone, leaving a harsh, dusty silence in its wake. Cassidy worked tirelessly, keeping watch over both the Apache warrior and the tiny infant that had been entrusted to her care. The warrior, whose name she had learned was Kale, had shown signs of recovery, but he still lingered between unconsciousness and the fragile state of someone near death. Cassidy had seen many things in her career, many injuries that had tested her skills as a medic, but nothing had prepared her for the weight of Kale's pain and the responsibility of caring for his child. The baby, though small and weak, seemed to thrive under Cassidy's attention. She fed it, kept it warm, and watched as it began to slowly gain strength. Still, there were moments when Cassidy feared for the infant's life, but every time she held it close, every time she heard its tiny heartbeat, she felt a bond begin to form, one she hadn't expected. As for Kale, the man who had once been a fierce warrior, his recovery was slow, his wounds were healing, but the emotional scars were deeper, and Cassidy could see that in the way he would sometimes stir restlessly in his sleep, as though fighting against some unseen battle in his mind. It was the morning of the 5th day when Kale finally opened his eyes fully. Cassidy was sitting beside the fire, cooking a small meal from the meager supplies they had. The infant, wrapped in a blanket, rested in her lap, a soft coo escaping its tiny mouth. Cassidy glanced up as Kale stirred beside her, his face tight with pain, but his gaze focused on her. Where is she?" His voice was hoarse, and his throat seemed dry from days of not speaking. Cassidy stood slowly, careful not to disturb the baby. She placed a hand on Kale's forehead, wiping away the sweat that had accumulated during his fever. His strong features looked even more weathered now, but there was something familiar in his eyes, a sense of recognition that tugged at her heart. "She's here," Cassidy said gently, smiling at him. "She's safe." Kale's gaze moved from her to the baby, his eyes softening for the first time since she had found him. His hand, trembling slightly, reached out toward the child. Cassidy held the baby out for him to see. The warrior's expression shifted from pain to something else, something Cassidy could only describe as relief. "She's alive?" Kale's voice cracked, and he had to swallow before speaking again. She's mine?" "She's yours," she said softly. "And she's doing better now, thanks to you both." Kale's face softened even more, his lips parting as if to speak, but no words came. Instead, he simply closed his eyes, leaning back against the rocks, letting out a long, slow breath. Cassidy felt a pang of sympathy for him. She could see the weight of his past in his tired eyes, the burdens he carried. She could only imagine what kind of warrior he had been, what kind of tribe he had come from. "Do you remember how you got here?" Cassidy asked quietly, sitting back down beside him. She needed to understand what had brought him to this point, what had led him to be alone in this desolate world with only his baby. Kale shook his head slowly, wincing as pain flared in his chest. We were attacked," he murmured, "by raiders. They took everything. I don't know how I ended up here." Cassidy felt a chill crawl up her spine. She had heard stories of raiders in these parts, violent groups that ravaged settlements and left nothing in their wake. For Kale to have survived such an attack was a miracle in itself. But the baby was the true mystery. "You were lucky to survive," Cassidy said, her voice soft but firm. "You were unconscious when I found you. You've been through a lot." "I know," Kale whispered, his gaze lowering to the infant in her arms. His fingers twitched, but he didn't reach out to touch her. "I was not ready for this. I don't know how to take care of her. I'm not fit to be a father." Cassidy looked at him then, her expression filled with understanding. She could see the pain in his words, the shame he felt for being unable to protect his family, for being the last of his people. But there was something else in him, something that wasn't entirely broken, something that still had hope. You don't have to be perfect, Cassidy said gently, her voice calm and steady. No one is. But you're here now. That's what matters. Cale met her gaze then, and for a brief moment their eyes locked in shared understanding. It was as if the weight of the world had shifted between them, and Cassidy knew that from this point on things would be different. She wasn't just a medic anymore. She was someone who would help Cale learn what it meant to be a father, and together they would learn what it meant to be a family. Over the next few days, their routine settled into something more comfortable. Cale's condition continued to improve, and as he regained strength, he began to take on small tasks around the camp. He built a fire, helped collect water, and even tried to calm the baby when it cried. Cassidy watched as he fumbled at first, but with each attempt he grew more confident. She could see that he was beginning to understand what it meant to care for the little one in a way that was far more than survival. There were moments when Cassidy would catch him looking at the baby with a mix of wonder and fear, as if he couldn't quite believe that she was his daughter. But every time the baby reached out for him, Cale's heart softened, and the walls around him seemed to come down bit by bit. Cassidy spent long hours sitting beside him, teaching him how to properly feed and care for the infant. She showed him how to soothe the baby when it cried, how to hold it close when it needed comfort, how to be patient even when everything seemed too overwhelming. There were times when Cassidy felt the weight of her own loneliness, the distance between her and the home she had left behind. But it was in these quiet moments, teaching Cale to be a father, that she found a sense of belonging. She wasn't just helping him. She was building a bond with the baby, with him, and with a future she hadn't expected to find. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the canyon, Cale spoke again, his voice softer than before. "I never thought I could have a family again," he said quietly, his eyes on the baby. "I never thought I would have this chance." Cassidy smiled softly, her heart swelling with an unexpected warmth.
"Everyone deserves a second chance, Cale," she said. "You're doing it."
"You're here. That's what matters." And in that moment, as the stars began to twinkle above them, Cassidy realized that this strange, unexpected bond had become something more than just survival. It had become a promise to protect, to care for, and to build a new future. Days turned into weeks, and the desert winds began to cool as the seasons slowly shifted. Cassie and Cale had settled into a routine. They learned to trust each other, each of them growing in unexpected ways. Cale had found a new strength in his role as a father, while Cassidy, who had always been independent, began to feel something she hadn't in a long time: connection. The baby had grown stronger with each passing day, her little cries less frequent, and her tiny hands grasping at anything she could reach. Cale, though still uncertain at times, began to hold his daughter with an ease that surprised Cassidy. He had come to see her not just as a child, but as his responsibility, his hope for a future that had seemed lost forever. One morning, as Cassidy tended to the fire, she noticed a change in Cale. He was standing by the edge of the canyon, his eyes narrowed, scanning the horizon. Something had shifted in his posture, a tension that hadn't been there before. Cassidy watched him for a moment, then stood and walked over to him. "Cale?" she asked softly, her voice carrying in the stillness of the desert. Cale didn't turn immediately. He just stood there, still and silent, as if weighing something deep inside. Finally he spoke, his voice low and rough. "I feel something," he said, his eyes still fixed on the distant ridge. "I don't know what it is, but it's not right." Cassidy felt a cold shiver run down her spine. She knew that Cale's instincts were sharp. If he felt something was wrong, they needed to be cautious. She stepped closer, placing a hand on his arm. "Do you think they found us?" she asked, her heart skipping a beat. Cale nodded slowly. "Maybe. It's been too quiet. There should have been more people, more movement, something." Cassidy's mind raced. The raiders Cale had spoken of, the ones who had attacked him and his tribe, were still a threat. She didn't know how far their reach was, but she knew enough to be afraid. The last thing they needed was to be caught unprepared. "I'll get the supplies ready," Cassidy said quickly, trying to push down the fear that was creeping into her chest. "We need to move, get to higher ground where we can see them coming." Kyle turned to her then, his eyes filled with something darker than usual, something that made Cassidy's heart tighten. "I can't run anymore, Cassidy," he said quietly. "Not when she needs me." Cassidy reached out and gently cupped his face, making him meet her eyes. "You're not running, Cale. We're protecting what's ours. We'll be ready." Cale hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Together, they gathered their things, making sure the baby was wrapped securely and tucked safely into the sling Cassidy had fashioned for her. Cale moved with purpose now, his earlier uncertainty replaced by the focused intensity of a man who knew he had to protect what little he had left. As they made their way toward the high ground, the tension in the air was palpable. Cassidy kept glancing over her shoulder, her heart pounding in her chest. She kept the baby close, her arms wrapped around her tightly. There was no telling how many raiders were out there or what they would do if they found them. When they reached a small ridge overlooking the canyon, they stopped, setting up a small camp for the night. Cale's eyes never stopped scanning the horizon. Cassidy tried to focus on their immediate needs, checking the baby's temperature and making sure she was comfortable. But even she couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something they weren't ready for. Night fell, and the sounds of the desert seemed to grow louder in the silence. The wind picked up again, howling through the canyon like some primal warning. Cassidy and Cale sat in quiet conversation, speaking in hushed tones as they made plans. Cale had become sharper over the past few weeks, his warrior instincts returning, and Cassidy found herself trusting him more than she had in a long time. Hours passed, and just as they were beginning to think they might be safe for the night, a distant noise reached their ears, a faint thud, followed by another. The sound of footsteps, but not just one set. More. The wind had picked up again, but this time the noise wasn't from the storm. Cassidy's heart skipped a beat. "They're here," she whispered. Cale's hand instinctively went to the knife strapped to his side. "Stay close," he ordered, his voice steady. "Stay quiet, don't move until I tell you." Cassidy nodded, her breath shallow as she crouched low, the baby held tightly in her arms. She could feel the weight of the situation pressing in on her chest, but she forced herself to stay calm. She had learned a lot from Cale, how to be patient, how to wait for the right moment. The footsteps grew louder. Then, in the distance, the shape of several men emerged from the shadows, their figures outlined against the dim light of the rising moon. They were moving with purpose, their eyes scanning the ground in front of them. Cassidy's breath caught in her throat. It was them, the raiders. Cale had been right. They had found them. Cale's grip tightened on his weapon as he slowly stood, his body tensing, ready for whatever would come next. Cassidy held her breath, the tension in the air thick enough to cut through. She could see the men now, roughly 5 of them, all heavily armed and moving cautiously, as though they were aware of the possibility of a trap. "They're not here to talk," Cale muttered under his breath, more to himself than to Cassidy. "They won't leave without a fight." Cassidy felt her pulse quicken. She had no weapons, no real means of defense, other than her knowledge and Cale's protection. But she would not let them take him or the baby. Not now. Not after everything they had been through. "We need to move," she said softly, urgency in her voice. "We can't stay here." Cale nodded once, then took a deep breath. "You stay with the baby. I'll take care of them." "No," Cassidy said, her voice firm. "I'm not leaving you." "Not again." "This isn't about us anymore," he said quietly. "This is about protecting her. We fight together, but we fight smart." Cassidy hesitated, then nodded. She trusted him more than anyone. They had come this far together. There was no turning back now. The raiders were getting closer. Cale stood tall, his body poised like a predator, ready to strike. Cassidy shifted to the side, watching him, her heart in her throat. She had no idea what was coming next, but one thing was clear. This was a battle for survival, and it was far from over. The raiders were close now, their shadows stretching long across the canyon floor. Cassidy's heart raced as she stayed close to the rocks, her hands gripping the baby tight. She could feel the infant's warmth against her chest, her small body breathing steadily in the sling. Cale stood next to her, his posture rigid, eyes scanning the men approaching. The wind howled again, but this time it was drowned out by the sound of their footsteps, heavy, deliberate. Cale's hand hovered near the knife at his side, but his focus was clear. He wasn't just thinking about fighting. He was thinking about survival. Cassidy could see the determination in his eyes, but there was also something softer beneath it, something that made her heart ache. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for her, for the baby, for the life they were beginning to build. "We'll have to take them down fast," Cale muttered low and steady. His voice was calm, but Cassidy could tell the tension was building inside him too. The fight was coming. Cassidy nodded. She knew Cale was a skilled warrior. She had seen him in action before, and he had always been careful, precise. But these men were different. They had no honor. They were raiders, killers, and they wouldn't hesitate to take what they wanted. She had to do something. She couldn't just hide behind Cale anymore. This wasn't just about protecting the baby. It was about protecting the future they could have together. Her hands shook as she reached for the small tool belt she kept by her side. It wasn't much, a couple of tranquilizer darts, a small flare gun, and a few medical supplies. But it was something. Cassidy wasn't a fighter, not in the way Cale was, but she knew how to think fast. "We fight together," she said firmly, her voice low but full of resolve. Cale glanced at her, and for the first time he gave her a small nod. Together. The raiders were only 100 yards away now, close enough for Cassidy to see their crude weapons and the cold expressions on their faces. There were 5 of them, rough-looking men dressed in scavenged gear. The leader, a tall man with a scar running down his cheek, led the group, his eyes darting around as if he could sense something was wrong. Cale's muscles tensed as he prepared himself. Cassidy took a deep breath, her mind racing. If they could take out the leader first, the rest of the raiders might scatter. She had no idea how this was going to play out, but she trusted Cale. She trusted herself, too. "Wait for my signal," Cale whispered, his voice barely a breath. Cassidy nodded and held the baby close to her chest, moving a few steps back to hide behind a large boulder. She peered around it, watching the raiders get closer. Time was running out. When the leader took a step forward, Cale moved. Fast, like a shadow in the night, his body fluid and precise. He darted toward the nearest raider, using his knife with deadly accuracy. The raider never saw it coming. The man gasped. His throat slashed in one quick motion, and he crumpled to the ground. The others didn't have time to react. Cale moved again, this time disarming another raider before flipping them onto the ground. But there were still 3 more. Cassidy's pulse quickened. They had to act fast. She reached for the flare gun, her fingers trembling as she aimed it high into the sky. With a loud pop, the flare shot up, its bright red light bursting against the dark sky. It wasn't a perfect distraction, but it would be enough. The raiders turned their heads, distracted by the bright flare. Cale didn't hesitate. He took advantage of the opening and lunged at the next man, knocking him off balance before quickly subduing him with a swift punch to the jaw. But the leader, the scarred man, was still standing, his eyes blazing with fury. He drew his weapon, a large, crude rifle, and aimed it at Cale. Cassidy's heart stopped. She didn't have time to think. She acted on instinct. With one swift motion, Cassidy fired a tranquilizer dart at the leader's arm. He let out a shocked cry, his body jerking as the dart hit. His grip on the rifle loosened, and he stumbled backward, his vision blurring as the poison took effect. The leader collapsed to the ground, unconscious before he could react. The remaining raiders, seeing their leader fall, hesitated for just a moment. Cale took advantage of their uncertainty, using the last of his strength to disarm them one by one, knocking them out cold with expert precision. It didn't take long before the fight was over. The canyon fell silent again, the only sound the wind rustling through the rocks. Cale stood over the unconscious men, breathing heavily, his body covered in sweat and dirt. Cassidy stayed hidden behind the boulder, her heart still racing, the baby still secure in her arms. Are they gone?" Cassidy asked, her voice shaky as she stepped out from behind the rock. Cale turned to her, his expression softening as he saw the baby in her arms. "They're gone," he said, his voice hoarse but steady. Cassidy's knees buckled as the tension finally left her body. She let out a breath she didn't know she had been holding. Cale was alive. The baby was safe, and they had made it through together. Cale walked over to her, his face still hard, but with a flicker of something softer in his eyes. "Thank you," he said quietly. Cassidy smiled, her heart swelling with a warmth she hadn't felt in so long. "We're a team," she said simply. "And we always will be." They spent the next few hours securing the raiders' weapons and supplies, making sure they would be able to make it to a nearby settlement. The leader, now unconscious, was tied up and left behind, the rest of the raiders taken care of. There was no more immediate danger. As the sun set on the horizon, painting the desert sky with deep shades of orange and pink, Cassidy sat beside Cale, the baby cradled in her arms. The 3 of them were a family now, not by blood, but by choice. "You're not alone anymore," Cassidy said softly, looking at Cale. Cale turned to her, his gaze softening as he looked at the baby. "I know," he said quietly, "and for the first time in a long time I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." The winds of the desert seemed to calm, the danger of the day behind them. Cassidy, Cale, and the baby sat together, watching the stars begin to appear in the sky, a peaceful silence settling over them. They had made it through the fight. They had fought for each other, for their new life, and they had won. This was just the beginning.